Welcome to the Transatlantic Book Fair, co-produced by Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America and the UK's Antiquarian Booksellers Association. Today's special program is From the Printed Page to the Runway. My name is Lizzie Young and I'm a bookseller, a member of the ABAA and part of the PR committee. For those of you who are not aware, the ABAA was founded in 1949 to promote interest in rare and antiquarian books and book collecting, and to foster collegial relations. We strive to maintain the highest standards in the trade. All members agree to abide by the ABAA's Code of Ethics. Following this program, we hope you will consider visiting the Transatlantic Book Fair at transatlanticbookfair.com. It is continuously open until 8 p.m. Mid-Atlantic time on Tuesday, July 27th. And just a note, everybody's restocking their books throughout. So there's new stuff coming up all the time. A few housekeeping issues. We are recording this session and it will be available later date at the ABA's YouTube channel. This session is also streaming live on Facebook. If you have any questions, we encourage you to move your computer cursor to the bottom of the screen and write your question in the Q&A section. The ABA headquarters team will help us with those questions at the end of the session. If you'd like to share a comment with all in attendance, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists, two wonderful scholars in the textile and fashion world. Rebecca Kelly is a textile and dress historian focused on study of 18th and 19th century textiles and trade. She has taught courses related to the history of fashion and textiles at both Parsons and the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. She's the author of Fashion in the Gilded Age, a profile of Newport's king family in 20th century American fashion. She also contributed numerous subject and biographical entries to the recently published Clothing and Fashion in American History, a comprehensive encyclopedia. Our other panelist is Dr. Kate Strasdin. She joined Falmouth University in 2009 as an associate lecturer, teaching histories and theories to students. After completing her PhD in 2013, her research was published as a book by Bloomsbury Academic in October 2019, titled Inside the Royal Wardrobe, A Dress History of Queen Alexandra. She was the historical consultant for the exhibition Royal Women at the Fashion Museum, Bath in 2018, named as one of Vogue's top 12 exhibitions of the year. In 2011, she was awarded the annual Gervers Fellowship given by the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. She's an honorary deputy curator at the Totnes Fashion and Textile Museum in Devon. So without further delay, here we go.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be with you. And I'm actually in the southwest of England, in Devon. So it's really nice to be beaming across to everybody listening today. And I'm talking to you about a project that I'm currently working on, which is my second book. And it's actually a volume that hopefully your members will find really interesting. And without further ado, I will share my screen so that you can see the volume itself. Hopefully everyone can see that. Is that appeared? Great. So I'm talking to you today about a really rare volume of fragments that came to me about 6 years ago. And for any of you that may be familiar with a similar volume that's at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, it's a dress diary, and they really aren't very common. It is a book that was started by Barbara Johnson's album, is a book that was created in the late 18th and early 19th century as a means of one woman keeping a track of her dress expenditure by pinning fragments of cloth into an accounting volume, and then charting how much it cost per yard, talking about the kind of garment that it was made into, and then sometimes including pictures of the kind of garment that she was having made. But this is something different, and it looks like this. In 2016, I was given this book by a lace maker friend of mine. We both made lace, a particular kind of East Devon lace, Honiton lace, and attended a group. And she had asked me if I would like this book. And as soon as I saw it, I knew it's an absolute treasure. It's kind of A4 size, so it's quite a generous sized volume. And it's very fat. It's much fatter than the original book would have been. She had acquired it in the 1960s from Camden Market, a junk stall in London with no provenance. It was just a volume of fabric samples. And she was the wardrobe mistress of the National Theatre in London. She bought it because she thought it would be a useful way of looking at different fabrics from older fabrics in order to use them perhaps for her research when she was making costumes for the theatre. But she never used it, and she never knew where it came from. She didn't know anything about it. And she gave it to me. And as soon as I opened it, I knew it was an absolute treasure, because there are over 400 pages of fabric swatches pasted into the pages. There are more than 2,000 swatches in total. And above each swatch, which has been carefully cut, usually into these little octagon shapes, above each swatch is a handwritten note that includes a name, maybe a year, sometimes some additional details in tiny, tiny ink script. And it dates from the earliest entry, 1838, and it concludes in 1870. But there was no clue as to who had compiled this book, because everything was written in the third person. So it would say Fanny Taylor's dressing gown or Adam Sykes's waistcoat. It was an absolute mystery. And so I've spent the last 5 years trying to unravel where this mystery actually came from. And you can see just a sample of some of the pages there. But one of the swatches, and sorry it's a bit blurry, but this is I've kind of blown it up a little bit for you. This was one of the swatches that started to give me some kind of idea as to its origins. This little piece of ribbon, floral ribbon, has a caption above it that says, Emma Taylor's sash at Fancy Ball, Preston, September 1842. So this gave me, in the first instance, a location. And Preston is a town in Lancashire, in the county of Lancashire, in the north west of England. And it started to give me some clues as to where this book might have come from. And this is where this is a study that uses the material culture which is captured in this amazing volume, but then also has used a lot of original sources like prints. This is a print of the 1842 Preston Guild Fancy Ball. So this is the event that sash was actually worn at. So it's a fantastic sort of multidisciplinary mix of the printed image, word, original text, alongside these little swatches of material culture. So here is a visual representation of the actual event at which that sash was worn, but who Fanny Taylor was, I didn't know. Where she came from, no information. And then finally, I came across, when I started to transcribe each caption in the book, I came across this one and only instance that unlocked the whole book. So this is a swatch that reads, Anne Sykes, May 1840. And there are lots of swatches to Anne Sykes, amongst 100 other women. There are many, many names in the book. But this one reads, Anne Sykes, May 1840. The first dress I wore in Singapore, November 1840. It was the one and only time out of all 2,000 samples where she actually referred to herself in the first person. So it revealed Anne Sykes to be the keeper, the creator of the book. And it was that moment of epiphany, really, because suddenly all things seemed possible. Further on in the book, there was a wedding swatch that said Anne Sykes and Adam Sykes, 1838. September. And from there, I was able to discover the digitized record of their marriage certificate, and people that featured on that marriage certificate were also other names that were appearing in the book. So I'd found this whole community of people. And from there, it has been an absolute, it's been amazing to uncover the stories of many of the women who feature in the book that I have been able to track down just through that single entry. And thank goodness, just that one time she referred to herself, and I was able to discover who she was. So there is an amazing American connection with the album. Anne and Adam Sykes married in September 1838, and Adam was a prominent merchant who was posted to Singapore. In July of 1840, they sailed from Liverpool and landed in November, which is what as the swatch says, landed in November, and they lived in Singapore for the next 7 years, for the 7 years of their marriage. One of the names that features in the book that I thought was especially unusual relates to the swatches that you can see on the left here that are all labelled Mrs. Balestier. And I thought it seemed an unusual enough name that I might be able to find something out about it. And sure enough, I found out that Mrs. Balestier was actually Maria Balestier, wife of Joseph Balestier, who was the first American consul of Singapore. And also she was Paul Revere's daughter. So Paul Revere of the famous Longfellow poem, Paul Revere's Ride. Here is this amazing connection, and it proved to be one of my lockdown joys, actually, because I discovered this fairly near the beginning of the pandemic. And thank goodness that the Massachusetts Historical Society have digitized all of Maria Balestier's letters to her sister, Harriet. And I was able to read the letters that Maria was sending from Singapore back to her home in Boston, relating about her life in Singapore, which was very hard and tragic. She ended up, her only son died, and Maria herself died. But I did find a reference to Anne Sykes. Amazingly, she owed Anne Sykes 1 shilling for a pair of stockings, and I found the connection. So here's Mrs. Balestier, which was amazing. So it's this fantastic international life that Anne was living. She made all sorts of connections in the colony of Singapore while she was there, including, you can see here, this is a collection of Arab silks, as it says here, that she collected from somebody called Syed Omar, who was a merchant in the colony. And I like to think that Anne was this, I have a vision of her of being a slight menace, perhaps, wielding scissors and asking people for swatches of fabric when they least expect it. So all of these different people are contributing to her book. And I think she uses it a little bit like an autograph album, that she's memorializing her life, but also the lives of people around her through swatches of their dress. And I think we can all relate to that notion of cloth being a very powerful reminder of parts of our lives and episodes of our lives. So there's all sorts of amazing swatches, including this one, which is, I think, perhaps my favorite. It's just a very simple piece of quite moth-eaten red flannel, but as you can see, the caption is quite dramatic. It says, "Part of the pirate's flag taken in Borneo by the Admiral, 1845. Sure enough, when I looked into this further, it related to Admiral Sir Thomas Cochrane, who was indeed on anti-piracy duties in Singapore at this time. He was charged with trying to save the Singaporean trade from the ravages of piracy. And he attended a lot of the entertainments in Singapore at that point, and at some time encountered Anne Sykes, who appears to have requested a contribution to her album, and he duly gave her a piece of the pirate flag that he had captured. The red pirate flag meant no quarter given, so no mercy. So it's a very dramatic piece of cloth. There are also all sorts of unusual entries, royal samples. So for example, this piece here of checkered black and mauve silk, has the caption above it that said Queen Dowager's dress, Malta 1839. The Queen Dowager was actually King William IV's wife, widow, Queen Adelaide, and she was actually in Malta in 1839. So somehow Anne has acquired this piece of cloth. I don't know how. There's another dress of hers here. Anne herself travelled to Malta in 1839 as well. So whether she met either the Queen Dowager herself or an associate of perhaps her household, I don't know. And there's also a piece of the Princess Royal's dress, the Princess Royal being Princess Vicky, who was Queen Victoria's eldest daughter. So there are all sorts of interesting anomalies that feature in the album, but primarily it is a volume of ordinary women, mostly women. There are some menswear in there, but mostly ordinary women, women who are those voices, those characters who are most often hidden from history. They're not the kind of women that were writing about their lives. They're not kind of women that are recorded in many other spaces. And so it has made this a remarkable book for its unremarkable women, but they're those hidden voices that have proved to be so fascinating. So I've written a book about this it's going to be across 20 chapters, and each chapter is a different woman that features in the book and a different theme associated with them, relating to 19th century dress practices. But I hope you've enjoyed that taster of the volume, and yeah, I'd look forward to chatting with you about it. Any questions, would love to hear them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate, for sharing your research with us. I think we're going to have a real fun time when we open up to questions in just a minute. I think there's some nice overlap between our stories, but if everyone's okay sitting tight, I will share my screen and jump in and kind of continue along with some of the themes that Kate has already brought up about a project that also starts in the 19th century. So we're going to shift forward in time a little bit, the late 19th and early 20th century, and look at a women's story that's really recorded through the material culture of fashion in Newport, Rhode Island. So kind of cashing in on our great transatlantic themes as well. So let's see if I can gracefully figure out how to share my screen here. Okay, does that look okay? Excellent, thanks very much. So the slide that you see on the screen, The World in Motion, Fashion and Modernity, 1885 to 1945, is the exhibition title to an exhibition that is currently on display here in Newport, Rhode Island, across two venues, at the Newport Historical Society and the Autrain Automobile Museum, located on Bellevue Avenue in Newport. And it's a project that I began a number of years ago, and I think just kind of going forward here to my next slide, at the heart of the story is this woman here. Her name is Alice Gwen Vanderbilt, or Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II. And in the summer of 2016, I was invited by descendants of the Vanderbilt family to come look at a number of Louis Vuitton trunks and other lovely old trunks that had been stored in the family's attics for a number of years, many years, and everyone thought they were empty. So much like Kate's project, it just ended up being a real gem, a dream project for a fashion historian, if you will. And we knew a little bit more, about the provenance in this case than, Kate had to sort of work with her project. We knew largely, who the clothing belonged to. We knew quite a lot about Cornelius Vanderbilt and his wife Alice's life. They spent their summers here in Newport, Rhode Island, at this lovely cottage, as we call them, this tremendous Italianate style villa, finished or completed in the summer of 1895 for the family. So some of the things that we started to find, and I'm very grateful to the family, in particular Gladys Sapari, Cornelius Vanderbilt II's great-granddaughter, who has been just an incredible collaborator on the project and has so generously shared her family collections, not only with me, but now as we've moved forward with this exhibition project and hopefully a book project to come later with everyone. It's just such an insightful and really extraordinary story. So kind of collage together here, an image of Alice, one of the extraordinary late 19th century ball gowns that was found in the trunk with matching shoes. This particular gown was bought in Paris. It's made by the couture house of Maison Roof. So dress labels are really important to us. And again, I really came at the project initially from the material culture, the objects, but just like Kate found with her project, we were so fortunate to then have print sources to corroborate information that we were finding. There was also handwritten notes in many of the trunks in Alice's own hand. So she sometimes told us herself where she wore a particular gown and gave us some interesting information to think about why particular pieces of her wardrobe were saved. In total, we cataloged over 280 clothing items after we sort of cleared out all of the trunks and went through many, many cardboard boxes and all sorts of things. So rather extraordinary collection, which ranges in date from 1883 to 1930. And Alice had an extremely long life. So in many ways, her fashion timeline chronicles what was happening with late 19th and early 20th century fashion. She was born in 1845 and died in 1934 at the age of 89. So when we think about it, in my mind as a fashion historian, she navigated one of the most tumultuous periods in history to, have gone from these tightly corseted evening gowns of the Gilded Age, as we call it here in the States, to much more progressive knitwear, sports clothes, by the end of her life in the 1930s. Some of the things found in the trunks were also worn by her two daughters, and something that emerges from this is very much a women's story and her really close bond and relationship with her two daughters. On the left here, we see her older daughter, Gertrude Vanderbilt, who became Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the famed American sculptor, artist, art collector, patron of the arts, and her younger daughter, Gladys Vanderbilt, who through her marriage in 1908 became the Countess Széchenyi. She married Laszlo Széchenyi, Hungarian aristocrat. So the women lived a very international and transatlantic lifestyle, and that's very much reflected in their clothing. Prior to the discovery of this collection, there were only two known extant dresses in collections with Vanderbilt provenance related to this family. And this dress was made by Charles Frederick Worth in 1883. It's in the Museum of the City of New York's collection and is actually intended for a fancy dress ball. Alice attended her sister Alva's fancy dress ball in 1883 as an allegorical representation of electricity, if you will. And this dress is called The Spirit of Electricity. So, we had an inkling, of course, that Alice was of the social standing as well, that she would likely buy a lot of haute couture, probably shopped in Paris when she could, and we knew she was a client of Worth. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's wedding dress is in a collection here in Newport, Rhode Island, and it was made by Jacques Doucet, so also another interesting French couture house. So that was pretty much what we were expecting to find in the trunks, lots of couture, and we certainly did. Laid out here just as we were sort of discovering things. So this is sort of a real behind the scenes glimpse of a wonderful 1883 ball gown by Charles Frederick Worth that we now speculate Alice may have bought at the same time that she commissioned that really extraordinary electric light dress. And I was just sort of reflecting, on this image of the great dressmakers of Paris as they were illustrated in an 1896 edition of the Paris Herald. And, it's all men. And that was so interesting to me when I sort of stumbled across this. And Doucet and Worth, who I just mentioned, are represented here. And I've always been a little bit upset about this engraving, this image down here in the bottom right-hand corner that represents René Paquin, who was the financial backer of House of Paquin, but it was actually his wife, Jean, who was the creative director of that house that was founded in the very late 19th century. And Jean Paquin goes on to become one of the most important couturiers associated with early 20th century fashion. She was very innovative and progressive in her business practices, and I think in the designs and silhouettes that she was promoting as well. And through this collection, we realize as we move into the early 20th century that Alice Vanderbilt and her daughters really seemed to prefer the woman couturiers. They shopped a lot at the House of Paquin, and they shopped a great deal at another couture house that became very, very famous in the early 20th century, that helmed by the Callot Sœurs, or the Callot sisters. So we really were very interested in this kind of perhaps women's story that was emerging when finding a number of these really fantastic pieces. Here's another really extraordinary, one of my favorite pieces in the exhibition, this walking suit. And again, we're starting to see the silhouette change here as well. We're looking at a dress that, rather a tailor-made suit that dates from 1913. And again, kind of looking in the material culture, looking at the labels here, this was a really important piece because it does say Vanderbilt here, and the couture house number or model number is listed here. So the measurements were one of the really important things that helped us determine which women wore which of the gowns. So knowing that this piece was specifically Alice's, 1913, both of her daughters were married. So this was a really great insight into the collection. So we learned in 1913 that Alice did buy 2 of these tailor-made suits and a really extraordinary evening dress at the House of Paquin. And this is, again, some of our discovery photos. And here they are as they look this summer in Newport on display in our sort of interpretation of a couture salon here in Newport. And again, it was really wonderful to, be working with the material culture. Like Kate, as the run up to this show was coming about, we were in lockdown here on the East Coast of the United States due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it actually forced me to stay at home and to really start going through digital archives and really just digging a little bit deeper into this story. And one of my favorite sources that I came upon was this publication done really as a promotion for the haute couture industry in 1910. And it's part of the Internet Archive, which has published so many great, out of print publications. So scholars from around the world can access them. So this little book, The Creators of Fashion, if you will, has these really wonderful photographs taken by Leon Roger Miles. And, they really show you this behind the scenes glimpse of the haute couture industry. So this really gave us a lot of inspiration for the exhibition design and, thinking about what types of stories we wanted to share with the public, so we wanted to talk about the Vanderbilt women, of course, but we wanted to also go behind the scenes, if you will, and really talk about all of the women that participated in the fashion industry, the embroiderers, the women who were the vendeuses, or the saleswomen in the couture houses. And a lot of their stories slowly but surely started to emerge. And one of the things that I love about this publication is it's not just from the elite shopper perspective. It takes us into the garrets or the attics of the couture houses. This is the illustration department, hard at work here, and then really extraordinary, all of the women working in one of the custom embroidery salons. So again, I think it's really wonderful to combine, the material culture and take this real interdisciplinary approach as a curator when we tell stories through objects. Something else that started to emerge, and sorry, my slides a little bit out of order here. I think I wanted this one first, was not just the Paris dressmakers labels. And again, this was, I think, the real surprise for us of just how much Vanderbilt did shop in New York City. And again, having a lot of time to do an enormous amount of research. And again, I learned about this dressmaker here, M. O'Hara, turns out to be Molly O'Hara, through the label first. So I came to it by seeing this label in this extraordinary suit, this really great 1913 black silk hobble skirted suit that really, from a fashion historian perspective, I was like, wow, this is a really beautifully draped suit, and very obvious to me that Molly O'Hara was following closely the trends that we were seeing when you look at what was happening in France in the early 20th century. So luckily for me, when I had some downtime and some access to Condé Nast archive through being in my home library at home, Googling around, as soon as I started researching M. O'Hara, Molly O'Hara came up pretty quickly. And luckily for me, I couldn't believe the good fortune. There was actually an image of her that was published in Vogue magazine in 1897. Molly O'Hara won a design competition that was sponsored here in New York City. Vogue magazine put on this competition where they asked American designers to work up half-scale, kind of little miniature dolls almost, forms, and they were going to showcase their dresses. Society women really supported design prizes, and the Whitney family was a big supporter of this competition. And luckily, Molly's dress, a dinner gown that she designed, won first place. So she got a lot of accolades, and she was photographed and appeared in Vogue magazine. So that was really wonderful. And through the label here, we knew that initially her dressmaking establishment was at 21 East 49th Street. And then I started looking at her advertisements, and I noticed something really interesting. I'm sorry if it's too small here, but right here in her Vogue advertisement, she mentions that she had a resort shop in Newport, Rhode Island, at a building that we still call the Audrain building today. The Audrain building will kind of come back into our story. It's actually the current location of the Audrain Automobile Museum, so hence the partnership that comes about with that museum. But the Audrain building was built in 1903 by a man named Adolphe Audrain, and it's right on Bellevue Avenue, and it was meant to be high-end retail space. So Molly was in that spot with Brooks Brothers, and through advertisements, we know a lot of other high-end luxury purveyors came and occupied this building just for the summer months. They kind of followed their New York client base to this resort community of Newport, Rhode Island for the summer season. So that was really interesting to discover. I also worked really hard. I'm not really a document person, so I relied a lot on my colleagues at the Newport Historical Society to use, again, the time that I was separated from the objects to comb through census records and kind of try to figure out more about Molly's life. We did discover that she was born in Kilkenny, Ireland, that she immigrated to the United States when she was about 20 years old. She arrived here in 1896. And her story is just really an extraordinary one. She ran into sort of both personal and professional troubles in her life, which were, I'm sure, not great for her. But from my standpoint, a lot of her history is documented in court records. She was sued on 3 different occasions, but through a lot of these court records, we learned a lot about the operation of her business, and other names came forward, women who worked for her. She had a business partner named Sarah Thompson, and Sarah Thompson was really the day-to-day manager, I think, of both the shops in New York and Newport. Molly O'Hara label eventually expanded and had a 3rd resort shop in Palm Beach, Florida. So Sarah was really managing the day-to-day operations of the store. And Molly really was the creative director and the international buyer. So she was traveling biannually to Paris. So she didn't just design clothes, she also really advertised that she was an importer of clothes as well. And we've learned that her business was extremely financially successful. In order to travel to Paris and to gain access to licenses to legally copy French fashions in New York was a tremendously expensive undertaking. So again, it's really through books and documents and periodicals and archives that so much of Molly's story has been pieced together bit by bit. So just like Kate's project, so much detective work. Also thinking about our theme here from the printed page to the runway, the Vanderbilt women engaged with fashion in another really unexpected way from my perspective. They really connected ideas of fashion and philanthropy. They were enormous supporters of a number of charitable fashion shows and design competitions, which again, I think that's initially the way that they first met Molly, was by this design competition. And in the summer of 1914, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney is depicted on the screen here. She and her mother and the other women of Newport really brought this international fashion show to Newport, and it was staged here at the Rosecliff Mansion. It's really regarded in fashion history as a particularly important moment. You know, when did the kind of the catwalk style fashion show manifest is a question that a lot of us have. And this was certainly an early example of one of these fashion shows. The fashion show was meant to promote American design, you know, via naval blockades and other things occurring during the era of the First World War. Information about European fashion was not coming so quickly to the United States. So American designers were kind of stepping up and doing more independent and original design work that was showcased at this fashion show called the Fashion Fete. The public was invited to the Fashion Fete. The funds raised at the Fashion Fete were dispatched immediately to France and were really slated for the war relief effort, particularly for women and children who had been displaced from the outbreak of the First World War. So here we see another really extraordinary cottage, if you will, as we call them here in Newport, where you see women dressed in costume. There was some tableau vivant at the start of the fashion show. You see a sort of allegorical representation of the Statue of Liberty representing the United States. This is Joan of Arc. Sorry if it's kind of tiny, but it was meant to sort of represent the great Franco-American Fashion Alliance, and again, the Allies during the First World War. Other entertainments included this incredible ballet that was danced on the back lawn. And this image here represents some of the wonderful resort fashions that were showcased at the fashion show. So in Newport, we kind of key into some of these costumes for polo, costumes for after tennis by Abercrombie and Fitch. These lovely young women in bathing costumes actually opened the fashion show, and they just kind of charged out and jumped into that fashion fountain where we had seen the ballerinas previously. So it was quite a sensational event. And these photographs were taken by Ira Hill, a famed society photographer at the time period, who was dispatched to Newport to record this fashion event. Molly O'Hara was one of the designers who participated and advocated heavily for this fashion show. She participated in both the initial staging of the show, which was in November of 1914 in New York, and then the resort restaging of it here in July of 1915. And the costume that you see on the right-hand side here is a garden dress called Casino, named after Newport's famed stick and shingle style casino, which is the current home of the International Tennis Hall of Fame. So I really love this photograph, and I think just a lovely garden party dress. And just a couple of other outtakes from the day, but it got, a multi-page spread in Vogue magazine, and I think it was a really important moment for American fashion. And again, one of the other themes that has really come to the forefront of this story for me is how resort communities like Newport, I think, really did contribute to this sense of American fashion as being something distinctly different than the couture looks that were coming from Paris, and heavily influenced by the leisurely lifestyle enjoyed in resort communities like Newport. So again, here are some of Alice Vanderbilt's fashions from the trunks. So kind of taking a peek back at the material culture. Charles Curzon, another New York-based retailer. She shopped a lot at American department stores such as Bonwit Teller, and another dress by Molly O'Hara. I was hoping to find later images of Molly or more photographs of Molly. The only thing that did pop up is on the right-hand side of the screen. You see this lovely illustration of her that appeared in the New York Herald Tribune in 1917. So she's looking, I think, very stylish and mature, I think, and accomplished here in this illustration. And she was sketched by an illustrator while she was attending a supper party. She was very much part of the New York Cafe Society and was known to dine out, apparently, on Sunday evenings at a well-known restaurant in her neighborhood. So that's the only other image of Molly that has turned up. And I wanted to share with you this vintage photograph of the O'Drain building, the 1903 building where her shop was located. And she was there from 1908 to 1929. So she had a really long career. We know some of the young women whose names have come to us who excitingly got jobs at the Newport Resort Boutique. A young woman named Agnes Sullivan writes about working for Molly and then getting the opportunity to go back to New York with her in the winter season. So that was exciting to find. We found information about some of the women who did embroidery for her, as well as Alice Vanderbilt. Molly O'Hara created costumes for Broadway productions. First Lady Grace Coolidge was a client of hers as well. So again, all these little tidbits of information, piece by piece, kind of completing Molly's story. Here's the O'Drain building as we know it in Newport today, home of the Car Museum. And when we were looking for a place to stage the exhibition, gallery space at the Newport Historical Society is limited, a little bit small. So we approached the O'Drain Automobile Museum if they would want to do a collaborative project with us. And they right away said yes and agreed to let me restage an interpretation of Molly's boutique in the Car Museum. So that was really exciting. So on display at O'Drain Automobile Museum through August 22nd is an exhibition entitled Women Take the Wheel, Fashion, Modernity, and the Automobile. So it was Molly O'Hara that initially brought me together with the O'Drain Automobile Museum. And, here's some outtakes of how we've sort of interpreted her boutique and workshop in the O'Drain building. But as we started going along, we also started to discover a lot of really interesting connections between Alice Vanderbilt and driving, Gladys Vanderbilt and driving. So it really became a great kind of two-part companion show. So scattered in other parts of the museum are some really great early cars, and they gave me this back section of the museum to create that sense of the boutique again. But when you first enter the museum, there's some really extraordinary early 19th century cars. These two, the white Mercedes that you see here, the red Renault. This belonged to Alice Vanderbilt's nephew, William K. Vanderbilt Jr. This car, we believe Alice and her daughter Gladys were driving down Bellevue Avenue in it in 1905. So some really great stories kind of came to the surface that way. And again, this really looks at women's fashion from about 1905 through the end of the Second World War, so 1947. So really tracing this great fashion history story. People get to look systematically at the changes, dramatic changes that became to automobile design and fashion design, through the early 20th century, and concludes with Gladys Vanderbilt, as she was born, later the Countess of Cheney's extraordinary 1941 Cadillac, and a really wonderful suit by Hattie Carnegie of New York that she wore later in her life. So I think that was an awful lot of information, but just again, I think a real great behind the scenes look about how, as fashion historians, we're challenged to work interdisciplinary, shifting back and forth between the material culture and the print culture to, complete and share these stories with people. So thanks so much for having me. And I just would love to kind of open it up to questions, switch back over, and maybe talk some general ideas and themes about ideas that came up in both my talk and Kate's.
Thank you so much for sharing, both of you. Your research sounds fascinating. We did have one question come up in the chat already. Is there a book in the works about Molly?
Yes, thanks so much. We're just starting to really get going with that now. We're looking for potential publisher, but we do have a proposal that we have out there, and several places are interested to work with us on it. So thank you. Yes.
That's awesome. If anyone in the audience has a question, you can feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A box. But I have a question for both of you. Do you have a favorite garment that you've encountered in your research, whether the actual physical object or in a book or in a drawings form?
I do. So I spent 10 years researching the wardrobe of Queen Alexandra, which was my PhD, which has been scattered all over the world. So her, similar to the Vanderbilts, actually, she really favored a lot of French couture. And so you see female, like the Morin Blossier, various female-led houses, which I always thought was really interesting. But one of my favorite garments was when I saw some of her pieces at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, and there was one particular dress that was embroidered with purple irises, well, hand painted with irises and then embroidered with all sorts of bugle beads. And it just, it was one of those where it's only when you look at the object itself that it really reveals its story, because it didn't really fit properly on the mannequin. And it looked like it was shoddy. It looked like it hadn't been very well made, but it's Morin Blossier, it's French couture. And I ended up getting in touch with a curator in New York who had worked with some of her garments that they have at the Met, and Jean Drusdo, and she said, well, that's really weird because none of hers fit our dress figures either. They're just, there's something weird about them. And I ended up contacting an orthopedic surgeon because Alexandra had suffered rheumatic fever when she was during her 5th pregnancy, and it left her with a limp from her early 20s, and this dress dated to about 1903, so she's well into her 50s. And I said, well, what if you've been limping for most of your adult life, what are the kind of impact physically? And he said, oh, well, definitely a curvature of the spine. And then suddenly the dress makes sense, because that dress had been made to accommodate a curvature of the spine in a very form-fitting gown in a way that would make it not obvious to onlookers. And she was a very private woman but had this very public life, and so it was a great example of a dress that tells a story that you couldn't get any other way. So yeah, I think that's a favorite for me.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Kate. I've been really interested in your research since we met just a few days ago. I was so fascinated to see that in your biography, and I probably should have put it in this PowerPoint because Alice Vanderbilt did present her daughter Gladys and her friend Dorothy Whitney at the court of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra in 1905. And she wore a gown by Maison Roof, a beautiful ivory cream satin decorated with rhinestones. So that's one that is currently on display at the Newport Historical Society, and it has just been a real favorite of mine. And I think right now I've been so immersed in this project, and I've just been completely intrigued by these two Paquin tailor-made suits that I showed in the slides today. So I've been thinking a lot about those dresses and the engineering of the woven fabric. So the stripes line up, and they just have so many great details. So those Paquin pieces have been really interesting to me. And yes, I had a lot of trouble dressing this show. It was really tricky. And I think we find the same things. Alice was very petite. We could, of course, find no, mannequin commercially that worked. So all of the forms are custom carved, as so many women in this time period. Again, when you're dressing couture, it's made specifically for that person. So interesting to think about.
We have one question specifically for you, Rebecca. Did Molly have any extended family that came from Ireland?
She did. She came with her mother, her sister, and her aunt. And in census records, they're all listed as milliners and dressmakers. I think they knew where they were going. There was already a group of Irish immigrants, living in the area of New York that they landed. So I think they knew other people from Kilkenny. Her first husband was already set up in New York, and I think that they had a relationship when she was coming here. And initially they were in the dressmaking trade together. A man named David Seaton was her husband, and I think the women came as second class passengers. So they had a little bit of money behind them and landed here, I think, with a step up from maybe what others had encountered. But what she accomplished in her lifetime is just extraordinary. Her business was a multi-million-dollar business by the time her estate was being settled when she died in 1941.
Wow. This question's for both of you. Did you discover the cost of the gowns when examining the businesses or the dressmakers? And what's the impact of fashion on other members of society or the working woman?
I managed to spend quite a lot of time at the Royal Archive in Windsor, which is in the Round Tower of Windsor Castle. And some of Queen Alexandra's wardrobe accounts survive. So it was possible to look at how much she was paying for. So for example, one of the first entries for Morin Blossier gown that she paid for was about £950 in 1903. So that amounts to many thousands in today's currency. So she was spending a lot. And it's just the sheer range of objects as well. When you look at something like wardrobe accounts for somebody like Queen Alexandra, it's hatters and bootmakers and corset makers and tailors and lace makers and embroiderers. There's a whole the range of suppliers that are feeding that particular just one person, and that's really fascinating. So yeah, they're all listed, not often a description of the object themselves, but you do get accounts of those costs.
I found really similar information. Again, we don't know for every dress, and things were sort of so piecemeal, and records are a little bit incomplete. But a lot of Alice's gowns, were about $5,000 to $8,000 American dollars by today's standards for a completed piece. And Molly was definitely, a high-end retailer, but it's interesting to see how things change in the 1920s and 30s. Molly was really sticking very much to that couture model in the early part of her career. But in the 1920s, around 1921, she sort of starts changing up her business practice a little bit and started buying simpler printed silks that were probably produced in New York rather than importing the high-end brocaded silks from France. So that was something that was really interesting. And Alice Vanderbilt does sort of acknowledge that she really is starting to like the New York fashions, that she likes the simpler sleeves. So she kind of communicates that in some of her writing. So I thought that was really interesting.
Someone wants to know if they want to begin doing research online for, wardrobe from past eras, what would be a good resource to begin looking into?
For me, what has been amazing researching the Anne Sykes book is just how much is available digitally. I mean, compared to 20 years ago, even the digital humanities has just exploded, so that it's possible to, of course, you've got the museum websites. So, I mean, the Rhode Island School of Design have their museum. You can access images, and curators have done so much work over the last few years to digitize images and then give you context of either wearers or makers and all of that. So I think museums are often a good place to start, museum websites, because they give you such rich detail. And then you do have things like Internet Archive, which Rebecca mentioned. They have out of print sources. If you are able to, you can access Vogue online. Those digitization processes are, so it is possible to make great connections with different research sources online. But of course, then you as and when things open up more fully, there are all sorts of archives that are fantastic to visit in actual real life, which feels like a whole other lifetime ago now. But yeah, I think the number of digital resources, and particularly the work that museums have done in recent years, is just tremendous.
Yeah, I agree with Kate. I depend a lot on museum websites. In particular, a great starting point for fashion history research is the Fashion Institute of Technology's Fashion History Timeline. I really love that resource, and it's so much based not just on material culture. It connects to great archives of portraiture, which Kate and I, I'm sure, use just so much. There's some great portraits in Kate's talk today. As well. So I really love FIT's Fashion History Timeline. I also listen quite regularly to a really wonderful podcast. So if you're just starting out and really interested in fashion history, I recommend the podcast called Dressed, that is hosted by April Callahan and Cassidy Zachary. They just, tip off so many just really wonderful topics. And then you can, they put up so much background information and leads if you're interested in knowing more about the subjects that they address on the podcast.
That's great. We have two more questions. The second to last, do either of you personally collect printed matter relating to fashion? Are there any guides to the literature which indicate seminal works on the subject, or subject particular catalogs, periodicals, which would find a place in an institutional or private library?
I don't deliberately collect printed material, but I do have a collection that I just couldn't forego, which I found in an antique store in my hometown a couple of years ago. And in the window there were some magazines which were Parisian 1920s fashion magazines in full color, and there were 60 of them, and they're just beautiful, all in French, amazing illustrations. And yeah, I just couldn't resist. So I do have those at home. And I'm also a really big fan of things like the Queen newspaper, because the Queen, for me, it contained a lot of reports about what the royal family were wearing at the time that I was doing Queen Alexandra research. So that for me was a really great source. And if I ever came across them on eBay or wherever, I would try and buy copies of the Queen. It's the Queen Ladies newspaper and court circular. So it was a great source of descriptions for Alexandra's wardrobe in particular. But as far as catalogues, there are so many amazing books relating to dress history now. I think one of the best as a starter that gives you an overview is one that was published by the Kyoto Costume Institute, and it's called Fashion, I think, from the 18th to 20th century, and it's like a Bible of it's a really big volume, but has amazing images in it and just kind of takes you through that timeline. And also the V&A in London did a good fashion in detail series that takes you across various periods as well. So they're good places to start, I think.
I think much like Kate, I don't intentionally collect, but I stumble upon amazing things occasionally that I feel that need to be saved. I also love to point things out to institutional libraries where I have affiliations. Sometimes I scoop up great things in antique shops, and I was really lucky to find a Vogue magazine from September of 1915 when that wonderful Newport fashion show was featured. And I was searching and searching for that and found it via a dealer. So that was really wonderful. So I do keep my eyes peeled. My great grandmother was an embroiderer and a lace maker. She was actually born in Brighton, Kate, and came to the United States. So she's from the south of England. So I really liked old needlecraft magazines, and I've inherited a lot of her lace. So I'm always interested in learning about that and working on my own embroidery. And I like to revive and try a lot of old patterns. And I think from an American perspective, a really great book for fashion historians starting out is a book called Modern Fashion, which actually begins in 1858 and carries you through the contemporary period, by Nancy Deal and Daniel James Cole. So that's a really great book that I recommend. It's a large, beautiful book, but a great tome for a budding fashion historian.
Final question. What's next for both of you in your research?
Well, I'm at the book edit stage of Anne Sykes's diary. So I submitted the manuscript at the end of April. And so I'm just waiting on the edits now. It's coming out, I think, next year with Penguin. So it is, yeah, that's exciting. And I can't quite see beyond that yet. I think until it actually has hit the press. Yeah, I'm still very much invested in, and I'd like to find out more. You know, I've touched on, although the chapters have focused on 20 specific women in the book, but there's still, I'm aware that there's still an awful lot of that dress diary that I have yet to uncover in more detail. So I don't think it's the end of that story. It's an ongoing piece. So yeah, I think she'll be with me for a while. Yeah.
For me, the same, really keeping going with the project that I have right now. We don't officially have a book deal yet for the Molly project, as I call it. And I'm starting to dig into, you know, some of the more hidden stories that take a little bit longer. The Breakers, the image of the amazing 1895 house that I showed on the screen today, is the second Breakers. The Breaker, an original Breakers, was a stick and shingle house that burned in 1892. And it's interesting to think if some of Alice's fashions were lost in that fire. And again, Molly's story doesn't really begin until the 1890s. So I think a lot about who was making Alice's wardrobe before she encountered Molly O'Hara. And another Irish dressmaker's name has come to the forefront of the story, a woman named Catherine Donovan. And I think Molly was really inspired by Catherine Donovan and emulating her career. So I'm really trying to, you know, think a lot about these women who came to the United States to sort of forge new path and new career in the dressmaking trades. So that's where I'm at with all of that. And of course, we know Catherine and Molly through the labels, but I really want to know who was working there and some of the seamstresses and the lace makers and the embroiderers. So lots of digging.
That's wonderful. Thank you both for being so generous with your time and knowledge and research and everything. I think everyone had a wonderful had a wonderful time, and the questions were great. Thank you to the attendees for those. Don't forget that the dealers, the exhibitors for the book fair are restocking their items. So do visit the fair. There are new items coming in through the very end, open till Tuesday. Thank you everyone for being here. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And it was lovely to meet everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Take care.